Hey, weaving pals, and welcome to another exciting installment in Dueling Rabbit's production series on weaving double harness structures without a drawloom. Today, we're going to examine the making of one of my favorite textiles of all time, Smålandsväv. The word Smålandsväv means weaving of Småland, Småland being a Swedish place name as well as the children's play area in pre-pandemic IKEA stores. The structure of the weave is a common one, simply a closely set plain weave ground, usually cotton or linen, with supplemental weft patterning floating above and below selected warp ends. The warp ends are threaded through the pattern heddles in groups, or units. For this gamp, the warp was threaded in units of 2 ends each. That means the minimum weft float length is 2 ends. You can see that in this section here. All floats go under or over warp ends in multiples of 2. 4 threads in these stripes. 14 ends in these long floats here. This is the side that faced up when I was weaving it. The other side is the reverse. This side is often considered the right side of the cloth, but I usually like how both sides look and often have trouble choosing. It's wise to keep the floats from getting too long, and the cloth often benefits from a lining of some kind. In Scandinavia, the structure is traditionally used for coverlets, especially with sheepskin backings, but it works well as upholstery fabric too. Smålandsväv is easily recognizable by its distinctive design. The pattern is usually arranged in columns and grids, often symmetrical, with simple geometric motifs that build and stack for an impression of great complexity. Because the pattern is threaded onto the loom, we alter the appearance of the design by changing the treadling order rather than the raised units themselves, as we do with Opphämta. For this reason, Smålandsväv is often referred to as treadled or threaded Opphämta. Another distinguishing feature of Smålandsväv is the way it is woven. The setup on the loom consists of 2 harnesses, a plain weave counterbalance ground harness towards the back, and a sinking shed pattern harness at the front. Now, even though we are using 2 harnesses, we are not using a drawloom. The frames for most Swedish-style countershed looms will work just fine with a few adjustments. This is my single harness Glamocra standard, with 2 types of Heddles, a couple of pulleys, and assorted bits and pieces from the hardware store. One thing to keep in mind before committing, it's a good idea to make sure your lower shaft bars fit inside the superstructure of your loom. The pattern harness forms a sinking shed, and you might get collisions otherwise. More about infrastructure requirements in due course. But before we consider the loom setup in more detail, let's examine the draft for my current project. Here is the beginning of the threading diagram of the 4 pattern shafts. The back of the loom is here at the top, and the front of the loom is here at the bottom. This is all that's typically shown on a Smålandsväv draft, with a note somewhere about the plain weave ground threading. But I'm going to draw that threading here for illustrative purposes, above or behind the pattern harness. My warp ends are alternating 1, 2, 1, 2, all the way across the warp. Let's turn our attention to the 4 pattern shafts. Because my pattern weft will be floating over and under pairs of warp ends, each of these pairs corresponds to 1 column in my draft. I think of these pairs as units. This pair goes with this column, and this pair goes with this column, and so on. On this diagram, black squares represent threaded heddles. A somewhat unusual feature of the draft is that many units are threaded on more than 1 pattern shaft at a time. Let's take a look at this unit or pair of warp threads here. You can see how it is threaded on each of the 4 shafts in turn. This pair is threaded on only 3 of the pattern shafts. It bypasses shaft 1 and is threaded on shafts 2 through 4. The next pair is threaded on shaft 1, skips shaft 2, and continues through heddles on shafts 3 and 4. Following this scheme, we can build up complex patterns across the warp with only 4 shafts and the simplest of treadlings. Published Smålandsväv drafts aren't all that common, and anyway, it's more fun to design your own. Here's a trick to doing it with a weaving program like Fiberworks, which is what I use. On my laptop, the typical Fiberworks draft appears like this. Here's the threading, the tie-up, and the cloth drawdown. Here's the treadling sequence down the side. I've enabled the Allow Multi-Petal Action option so I can fill in multiple squares in each row. Now, if I turn my draft like so, hey presto, Smålandsväv. My threading is now across the bottom, my tie-up is here, and my treadling goes up the side. As long as I ignore the fact that my warp and weft are running in the wrong directions, the drawdown of the cloth appears the same as when I sit weaving at the loom. In this setup, black squares in the tie-up represent connections to lowered shafts. If we concentrate on the treadle farthest to the right, we can see that the purple weft will float over all the lowered warp ends. Since I want to have as many ends in the floor of my shed as possible, the side of the cloth that faces up will typically be dominated by the weft color. The side facing down will show the opposite. Now let's head to the loom and look at the setup in more detail before we start to weave. We're standing at the back of the loom after having beamed the warp of 16/2 cotton. Since my units have 2 threads each, I held 2 threads in my hand while winding the warp in a 2x2 cross. This will make it much easier to thread the heddles on both harnesses without making too many errors. Here are the 2 ground shafts, which I'm threading first. These are outfitted with standard 28 cm white tie textile Heddles. It's pretty simple. Each pair of warp ends is 1 repeat of my ground threading. The first thread here is on the shaft furthest back, the second thread on shaft 2 towards the front. I repeat this arrangement all the way across the warp until every end has been threaded for plain weave. The threaded ground shafts stay at the back beam while I prepare to thread the pattern harness. Here I've hung my 4 pattern shafts in front of the ground shafts from my perspective inside the loom. Pattern shafts are fitted with the long eye heddles from my drawloom. As we've already seen, the threading for Smålandsväv can be a bit of a mind bender. Let's look at the threading diagram again before we get to work. Here are my 4 pattern shafts. Remember, each column represents 1 two-end unit. We'll turn our attention to this column here, showing that our pair is threaded on all 4 shafts. Back inside the loom with my long eye heddles, I take up the next 2 warp ends coming off the ground shafts, and I'll thread them through 1 heddle on each pattern shaft from back to front. 1, 2, 3, and 4. I push that pair aside and address the next. I take up the next pair coming off the cross and through the ground heddles. The next column of my draft tells me this unit will be threaded on 3 pattern shafts only. I'll skip the rearmost shaft, which is shown in white on my diagram. I thread my unit through heddles on shafts 2, 3, and 4 only. Done. Next, I'll thread a unit onto shafts 1, 3, and 4, skipping shaft number 2. And so on, following my draft all the way across the warp. Taking care and double-checking often are necessary for this rather challenging enterprise. Now I'm finished threading both sets of shafts. Here's my ground harness and pattern harness viewed from the side. Remember that in some columns the units were threaded onto the ground shafts only and bypassed the pattern shafts altogether. You can see that here. In addition to the requirements of the pattern, it's a good idea to have plain weave units at both sides of the piece, just as you do with Opphämta. For my project, which is going to be narrow cushions, these plain weave selvages will be concealed under the hem. These plain units will travel directly from the ground harness to the reed, as with this pair here. Next, I come to a pair that is threaded both onto the ground and the pattern harness. When the reed has been slayed and the warp has been tied onto the cloth beam, you can see the configuration of the harnesses in their final position. I've left the 2 ground shafts toward the back of the loom and moved the 4 pattern shafts to the front, right behind the beater. Both harnesses are suspended from simple boards, 1.5 by 3/4 inches, which I've slung across the top of the loom. I've placed them on edge to keep them from bowing. At this point, I'll adjust the height of the shaft holders to get everything in place before finalizing my setup. The warp is traveling in a straight line from the back beam to the breast beam. The ground shafts are hung so that the warp travels through the centers of the regular Heddle eyes. The pattern shafts are hung so the warp is traveling through the long eyes close to their tops. That will maximize the size of the sinking shed. Now I can finalize my setup. Above the ground shafts, I've hung 2 pulleys. These are weaving pulleys from Glamocra, but you could just use simple pulleys from the hardware store. I've hung horses below these, 2 for each shaft, because they give good stability to the system. An alternative would be to run the cords from the pulleys to each shaft directly, and then stabilize the shafts with buttonhole elastic. Buttonhole elastic is all I need for the pattern shafts, nothing fancy. Just some way of allowing me to lower one shaft at a time and ensure it snaps back to neutral after its treadle has been released. Speaking of which, here we are inside the loom contemplating the simplest tie-up of all time. I've removed the loom's lower lambs and am connecting to the short lambs only. Remember, short lambs sink. Here at the back is the plain weave tie-up for the ground shafts. The counteraction of the pulleys means I only need 1 cord per treadle. Likewise, on the pattern shafts, I'll be pulling down only 1 shaft at a time. My cords with their black beads are tied up for straight treadling. Okay, let's see how the mechanics of this setup does its business. When I press on one of my ground treadles, I open a counterbalance shed on the rear harness. This is reasonably deep, and I can use my standard Glamocra boat shuttle for the plain weave rows. Seen from my vantage point weaving at the loom, the dense arrangement of warp ends in the plain weave shed is clearly visible. Now, the pattern shed. I step on a treadle and 1 shaft goes down. This gives me a somewhat shallower shed, which is why I tend to use my damask shuttle for pattern rows. When I insert this paper into the shed, you can see I will get weft floats above the threads that have been lowered. This is an opposite action to traditional Opphämta as woven with half Heddle sticks or on a drawloom. So now we are ready to weave. My ground weft is the same as my ground warp, which is 16-2 cotton. My pattern weft is Faro wool. I've slayed my reed at 14 ends per centimeter, which allows me to weave to square. Since my units are 2 warp ends wide, I will need to weave 2 pattern picks alternating with 2 plain weave picks for each row of my pattern. It's going to look like this. My 2 plain weave or tabby treadles are here. My 4 pattern treadles are here. Although we can mix it up however we like, I'm doing a straight pattern treadling for this piece. Pattern 1, tabby A, pattern 1, tabby B, pattern 2, tabby A, pattern 2, tabby B, pattern 3, tabby A, pattern 3, tabby B, pattern 4, tabby A, pattern 4, tabby B. This thing is practically going to weave itself. Let's see what the 2 sets of shafts are doing while all this treadling is going on. I press my pattern 1 treadle and the rearmost pattern shaft goes down. I'll throw my pattern pick and release the treadle. The shaft will snap back to neutral. Next, I'll step on tabby A to open my first counterbalance shed on the ground harness. 1 shaft goes up and 1 shaft goes down, pulling warp ends to the tops and bottoms of the long eyes of the pattern Heddles. I'll throw a tabby pick. I'll release my tabby treadle and press the pattern 1 treadle again. I throw the second pattern pick for this row. I release the treadle and press tabby B. My second counterbalance shed opens. Throw my pick and go on to the next row of my design. You can see how the two harnesses are working together to create my ground cloth with pattern floats. Because all of the hard work was done at design and threading time, the weaving itself is going to go pretty fast, and I'm not going to need a treadling chart to keep track of my progress. I love the flow of this weaving, and I love the aesthetics of the result. Getting a single harness countershed loom rigged for Smålandsväv is a rewarding and exciting introduction to double harness weaving. Full disclosure, my early adventures with structure convinced me that a drawloom was in my future. So jump on in and try it. It might lead your weaving in surprising directions too.